Hi, Dr. Centeas. Thank you for coming to my final presentation today for Latin American Studies Spring 2026 at the Croft Institute. Today I'll be talking about French colonialism in Haiti and Haitian migration. So just to give a brief overview of colonialism in Haiti, which was formerly known as Saint-Domingue, it was colonized by France in the 17th century. Unfortunately, they did eradicate the indigenous population for most of the island of Haiti, which means that they then had to import slaves to come in and work all of the plantations that they'd set up there. It was one of the most profitable colonies at the time. Again, they did have lots of plantations. They focused on coffee and sugar production. But then the colony did gain its independence after a year that lasted several years, or after a war that lasted several years in 1804. So then just to really briefly run through Haitian migration. This is a bit of an old figure, but there are around 731,000 Haitians in the US, or there were in 2023. They're not exclusively going to the US. There are lots of migrants also going to Brazil, Bolivia, and other Latin American countries. So what are they fleeing exactly? They are mostly running away from things like gang violence, which is very prominent in Haiti. Also political instability, as well as natural disasters, which I know we can contest if they are actually natural or not. I did look into the 2010 earthquake, and it did seem to be somewhat natural, though of course their infrastructure was not very well structured to support the population after something like that happened, which did worsen the effects of the earthquake. And then, of course, also poverty. Haiti is unfortunately one of the poorest countries in the world. I also did want to point out this figure from the Pew Research Center, which was saying that in 2021, we did see a huge increase in migrants from Haiti into the US. Of course, 2021 was when their president was assassinated, so I'm assuming that this rise was fleeing from political instability at the time. So, how can we relate these two ideas together? I think one of the first most important things that we can talk about is the economic instability that comes from all of the colonization that we saw early in Haiti's history. And that, of course, was primarily from the debt to France. So after the revolution, France did actually charge Haiti a lot of money for loss of property, primarily slaves and plantations, which I want to say, and I don't, this isn't a verified statistic or a verified year, but I believe that it wasn't paid off until about 1947. So yeah, having to pay that off and being in debt all of those years did, I mean, it economically devastated the country, and we're still seeing the repercussions and the poverty that's coming from that. Also, because it was a colony focused on producing crops and not as like a colony for people to move to, there was not a lot of investment into the infrastructure during the colonial period. So, not a lot of investment in schools or public transit, things like that. Which then, after the revolution, continued to not be extremely prevalent. And we can see that today. There is still a very weak infrastructure in Haiti. And then also that we had the post-revolution turmoil. So the emperor after the revolution of Haiti, there was just a lot of political chaos, and then we've seen that kind of continue into the U.S. occupation of Haiti, and then again, like I mentioned earlier, their very recent assassination of their president in 2021. So again, just lots of chaos and instability around politics, infrastructure, and economics. So how can we connect these to the course concepts? I think the most obvious one would be to connect it to hegemony, which we talked about a lot during our study of the colonial period, focusing mostly on how the colonizers came in and they used this sense of or they really tried to have the slaves accept that they were lesser than the colonizers. Again, of course, in a lot of different places, it wasn't specifically slaves. I'm just saying that because Haiti, the population was majority slaves. We also see a lot of commodity extractivism in this case study, which I thought was a really interesting comparison to Potosi and the silver mining, because as we saw in our studies, they they really tried to get out all of the silver that they could, and they kept pulling it and pulling it. And then when it started to run dry, the community was left desolate and a little bit broken, which I think is kind of what we see in a lot of these communities that focus on one resource, which gets a little bit into our third point of that resource dependency and the idea that the entire economy is structured around this one product. And if something goes wrong with that or it runs out, crops fail, then the economy cannot survive because it cannot sustain itself. Which also goes into a bit of another point about dependency theory, economic dependency on other countries. Because it is a country that focuses on exports, if you don't have other countries that you're in communication with and in these economic relationships with, you cannot support yourself. And we definitely see those happening in Haiti. And then all of these concepts are leading to the mass migration out of Haiti. Some might even say forced migration. So, to talk about policy changes here, I think I'm not quite well educated enough to give suggestions on Haiti's political climate and changes we can make to Haiti's politics. What I would say is that I think that we should focus on supporting Haitian migrants in this time. And of course, it's a little bit complicated. They did have temporary protected status in the US. I believe Kristi Noem recently reevaluated that and said that it was no longer necessary. I don't know if it has been finalized at this point. Last I saw, it was going through the Supreme Court, and there was going to be some cases on removing the temporary protected status of Haitian migrants. So, why this case study and what do we learn from this? I had several personal reasons why I chose to look at this. First of all, I'm very interested in commodity fetishism, which is something that I really started to be interested in when I read Sweetness and Power my sophomore year. I got really interested in the idea of separating the commodity potential of an object from the labor that it takes to produce that object. Of course, my thesis is also on commodities. But I just find that to be a very interesting topic. As well as, yeah, I also studied France, which is another important thing about why I chose this topic. I think this course has pushed me to think outside of what I've learned over the past 4 years and what I've studied specifically, and it's been really good for me to look at a new region. I did think it was interesting, though, to kind of bring those connections back at the end of this semester and reconnect it to take what I've learned in this course and reconnect it to what I've been studying through the past 4 years. And then finally, on a more personal note, I do work with refugees in nonprofits in Nashville. I have interned for several nonprofits and I volunteer as well. That's something that's very close to my heart and actually is going to be very integral into my future. So I think that learning about this and considering these two factors will really help me as I continue going into my work in international nonprofits. And then outside of myself, I think that it's very important to look at the history of how we've gotten to where we are in certain cases. So for this project, I think to understand how we can move forward with the crisis in Haiti and all of the migrants leaving the country, we have to understand the history and how we got here and what factors are at play, so that we can get to the root of the problem and not just treat the quote unquote symptoms. And finally, how has this project shaped my idea of Latin America? I think that I had originally had several ideas about Latin America, which you can see on the screen here. The first one was based on location, and I do think that this falls into that category and would thus be categorized as Latin America, meaning that it's, Mexico and South, it's in the Caribbean. This next one was a little bit interesting because I had also thought about Latin America being defined by a Latin language. being spoken in the country. And originally I had thought, yeah, Haiti definitely falls into that group because it speaks French. But then I thought about it more, and they don't speak French. They speak French Creole, and it's very different. Haitian Creole is very different from French, even though it resembles it in some ways, primarily in its components that are outside of Latin-based languages. So even though it has a little bit of Spanish as well, it also relies a lot on West African languages that came over with the enslaved people that were forced to move to Haiti. So in that category, it doesn't necessarily fall exactly under my idea of Latin America. However, I don't think that that disqualifies it, from being Latin American. I think it just broadens my definition. And then finally, I talked a little bit about this in our final in-class writing, and that is the impact of colonization, and defining Latin America based on its colonial history. What I had talked about in the in-class writing was a little bit more about how we can identify these cultures that have been a mix of the indigenous culture and the colonizing culture. And I think what's interesting about this case is that it is a mix of cultures, but there's not a lot of indigenous elements because the cultures that are mixed are all foreign to the island. So in that case, I do think that it falls a little bit outside of my idea of Latin America if I were going by that definition. But again, I think that this project in general has just helped me broaden my understanding of Latin America, especially being able to study a country that was colonized by the French rather than the Spanish or the Portuguese. And that's all I have for you. Here's my works cited. I have 2 pages, and I will also add you to the Google Slides presentation so that you can look at all of these citations and the presentation itself. All right. Thank you again so much for your time.